And I'd like to welcome everybody to Bloomington North Rotary this wonderful May 13th, 2021. I'm going to ask Jim Bright to introduce our speaker today. Jim, if you would take it away.
Okay, thank you, President Brian, and hello, Bloomington North Rotary friends. It's my pleasure today to introduce Colonel Stephen Lacy, who is a U.S. War College Fellow at the IU Russian and East European Institute. Colonel Lacy is a strategic intelligence officer with the U.S. Army, and he is an expert on Russian military subject matter with extensive experience in Eastern Europe and in Eurasia. Today, he will shed light on the historic and current influences that shape Russia's role in the world today. Colonel Lacy has spoken to 5 clubs, Rotary clubs, most recently Washington, Indiana Rotary Club yesterday, where he tells us they were maskless. At the Bloomington Rotary Club last month, Colonel Lacy quite possibly fielded a record number of questions. So counting on you all to ask some good questions as well. Please welcome Colonel Stephen Lacy.
Thanks, Jim. Appreciate that. And the questions are always the more interesting part of this. So we'll see how many of you are awake at the end of my presentation, and we can discuss that. So let me go ahead and see if I can share screen. And then I'll get right into the presentation. Try to do this. This is usually a presentation that takes 40 to 45 minutes when I've given it in the past. But I can do this pretty quickly, and then we can have more time for questions. So let me see. Okay, I've got it. Great. Can you all see the presentation? Thumbs up? Okay.
Yes, we see it.
Perfect. Okay. So a couple of things I want to say, ground rules up front. The first is that as an Army officer, I'm required both by law and policy to be nonpartisan and apolitical. So you can lob those political hand grenades at me, but I will probably deflect them if there are any questions at the end. We can talk frankly, but at the same time, I'm not going to be out of step with what my political leaders are doing. The second is that I actually love Russia, love the Russian people. I've been studying it for a long, long time. And so my briefing is not designed to be negative toward Russia, but just understand that anytime you're talking about a political system that is different from ours and where there are different interests in the world from another world power, then sometimes those things can not be congruent. And sometimes it's challenging for people. In fact, that's the other thing I wanted to bring up, is that part of our mission at the U.S. Army War College, when they send fellows out to universities, is we do a lot of public speaking, and we talk to folks about issues of national importance, or what the Army's message is. And this is one of the things in the intelligence world that I like to talk about, is these are issues that are very pertinent in Washington, D.C. and policymaking. And I think they're important for people elsewhere, right, in the heartland of America to see. So I want to make sure that Hoosiers have a lot of the same messages that you see in DC, and also that are relevant today in the news, because a lot of this will be relevant. So let me get right to it. Okay, and please save your questions till the end if you don't mind, and now I can get through this and then we can nerd out on all things Russia. So this is my agenda. I'm going to talk about a background to Russia's current situation. I love the history portion of this, but we can only talk in one slide very briefly because of time. And then I'm going to go through and use the Clausewitzian methodology and talk about ends, ways, and means, and where Russia's trying to go long term, at least like what most academicians and policy analysts tend to generally agree on. And since there's so much of this that's unclassified, that's been written about, it's pretty easy to put a brief together. We're going to talk about their sphere of influence and why that's important. And then at the end, I'm going to talk about some fissures and areas of weakness that Russia has that are things that people watch. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is Russia's historical perspective. So I can have any soundbite, if I can have any sort of mantra that I would leave with you, it's that Russia has a perspective on security that is different from the United States. We have some natural borders that have made it very easy for the United States to defend itself. That even in those rare instances when people have attacked us in our history, our oceans have largely been protective, or they've delayed things. Russia, on the other hand, is a land power that has been invaded from all directions in its history. Scythians and Persians in the south. It's had Mongols to the east. From the west, it's had everybody from, Poles, Nazis, Napoleon, there's many others. And even the Swedes and the Finns have, come from the north. So Russia has been invaded on all sides, and that's created a security dilemma throughout its history that makes it a state that cares very much about security, and has required it to have leaders that are probably stronger than you might have in other parts of the world. The other challenge is that because of that warfare, particularly the Mongol invasion and occupation, Russia came late to the Enlightenment. So when the rest of Europe was going through the Enlightenment, Russia had been an Orthodox Christian nation. Then they had the Mongol yoke. And so Russia didn't experience that same process that the rest of Europe did. So European Russia just didn't go through the same historical process. And then at the Bolshevik Revolution in the early 20th century, what few members of the intelligentsia who were producing literature, who were kind of on board with the Enlightenment, were largely eradicated in that society. So you had an entire generation of intellectuals that were gone, and the society didn't have the same development toward democracy as we do today. So when people think about Russia and they wonder why Russia thinks so differently than we do, it's because they had a completely different historical development. And it's important to understand that. And they've had security concerns that, quite frankly, we haven't had in the same way in the US. In the 20th century, now this is where I want to get into modern day Russia. A couple of things you need to know that I have on the slide is that Russia's largest sphere of influence was actually in the post-World War II period. So the Soviet Union was a largely Russian-dominated state. Yes, technically it had, satellite states, but Russia dominated the Soviet Union. And at the end of World War II, Russia ended up occupying most of Central and Eastern Europe. As a result of that, there's a lot of nostalgia in Russia for those good old days when it had hegemony over half of Europe. And this is something that the Russian state propagandizes extensively in media today. They're constantly beating the drum of the Great Patriotic War and the nostalgia for World War II and trying to motivate the population. Now that's becoming less effective, I think, over time, particularly with the younger generation. But that's something that is very important to understand Russia today. And then finally, in understanding what happened at the collapse of the Soviet Union post-1991, the 90s were a very difficult time in Russia, economically abysmal. I spent a few years in Ukraine during that time frame, and economically, it was like going through a Great Depression in the whole region. At the same time, you had the Warsaw Pact dissolve, and then you had NATO expansion slowly on Russia's borders. By 1999, Hungary, Czech Republic, and Poland, I believe, were all NATO members. Then in 2004, you had the Baltic states, and this was very alarming to Russia. That at all kind of coinciding in the late 90s with the war in former Yugoslavia, where Russian television was showing American planes bombing Serbia, which has a very close relationship historically, linguistically, and culturally with Russia. There was a turning point. And so by the mid-2000s, we saw Russia engage in military modernization and then start to engage in what some call asymmetric balancing. So the 2007 is cyber attacks in Estonia, the war with Georgia in 2008. A lot of these activities, I think, were related to Russia pushing back in a way that it could, recognizing that it wasn't strong enough to push back against NATO directly. So that military modernization since 2008 has occurred, and Russia, I think, has become far more capable as a military in the last decade or so, and that's important to understand. So that's the background I want to give you. So what are the objectives or goals of Russia? Where are they trying to get to? So most analysts and academicians, I think, would say that Russia's elite, and it's hard to figure out who's the elite because you have different groups, but you have your Siloviki, who are your security services, those with a security background who are in power in Russia, and other oligarchs. But generally, there are three main objectives that the Russian state has. The first is for Russia to be recognized as a great power. Many nations want this, but Russia has in its mind a glorious past, and it wants to be recognized as more than just a regional power, but a great power. And if you're a great power, you have a distinct sphere of influence, right? So You might remember back to your history lessons in high school when you similarly had trouble staying awake, the Monroe Doctrine, the idea that if someone is an emerging great power, they have a sphere of influence where they want to keep foreign powers out, right? We thought that the Americas were our domain, and Russia feels similarly that it has a sphere of influence, which I'm going to talk about. And then finally, a desire to see US influence curbed or scaled back. Now, you might think, well, why does Russia care about the US? Well, the US is heavily involved in Europe and has been in the 20th century, particularly with NATO. And we're roughly 70% of NATO's spending and military power. Now, that's important because it means that Russia doesn't really distinguish the same way between NATO and the US as we do. It looks as though that activity is somewhat synonymous because the US is the primary force generator for NATO. And Russia believes that trying to divide the US and NATO is important to achieve its objectives, and I'll talk about that later. So curbing US influence is important to Russia, and Russia also, unlike the US, doesn't believe in sort of that US business school win-win mantra. You know, we have a philosophy in the West that we can both win. We can come to an agreement and we can both be happy. The Russian state really much believes in a zero-sum game, right? For Russia to win, someone has to lose, and international politics are a zero-sum game. And that's an important distinction to make. Okay, so what's Russia's sphere of influence? There's a couple different areas, and people can disagree on these. I have sort of 4 broad categories I put out. The first is the former Soviet Union, okay? So for those of you who remember what that was like 20 years ago in our Red Dawn age, those were the countries, the Baltic nations you see there on this little map, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. And I put those in a separate category because they're now NATO members, and it's much harder for Russia to influence that. And then Belarus, Ukraine, the Balkans, Moldova, and then other stands that are not listed here. Russia considers those that are not NATO members proprietary, meaning it wants to have predominant influence as a great power in those nations, right? That's its backyard. It doesn't want foreign powers meddling there, and it's very concerned about any foreign activity that it sees there. The Western Balkans, on the other hand, are what we call non-proprietary. So those are areas that Russia has special interest in, particularly its relationship with Serbia, but it recognizes that there's going to be other influence there, and because of geographic reasons, it can't be proprietary there, but it has a special interest. The Black Sea, on the other hand, is what some in Russia would consider to be the Russian lake. Russia has a lot of firepower. It has a big navy in the Black Sea with a lot of capability. Some would argue far more capability than the other NATO nations combined there. Anytime, for instance, NATO or US ships transit the Black Sea, they're shadowed, there's overflights, sometimes it can get a little tense. And that's because Russia wants it to be known that it considers the Black Sea sort of its domain. And then finally, I put down the Eastern Mediterranean and far north. This is important to understand that while the Eastern Mediterranean is not Russia's exclusive playground, it is an area because of their naval base in Tartus and other strategic interests it has in the region that it's very active in that area. So it takes a special interest there. And in the far north, there are other considerations, some due to energy, but also because the Northern Fleet has the bulk of Russia's strategic nuclear forces in the naval strategic nuclear forces, and that's a particular interest to Russia. Okay, so what are the ways that Russia tries to achieve its grand strategy? Well, the first is trying to divide NATO and EU or NATO and US cohesion. Anytime there can be fractures in that relationship, if you believe in a zero-sum game, it's good for Russia and bad for us. The second is undermining Western credibility and showing what I would call an alternative way. Russian state media is constantly talking about the downsides to democracy. It's really fun to watch Russia Today or other stations and see the way that they portray the West and democracy. If you saw nothing but Russian television, you'd think it was just a complete mess here. I mean, chaos in the streets all the time. Anything bad that happens, if we have civil disturbances of any sort like last summer or protests, if we have, you can imagine the heyday that happened with the January 6th events in Washington, D.C. Those are portrayed in the most negative light possible to show how fragile democracy is. In fact, a famous or often repeated mantra on Russian television is that, see, they even have democracy in Africa, and what good has that done them? And it's the idea that though Russia technically has free elections, I think that's largely disputed, it's an autocracy in a way that we are not. And it likes to contrast its political system with ours. State capture is another way. You see this less frequently now than you did in the past, but this is the idea that you'd have small nations in the periphery of Russia that either by financially capturing its political system, whether it's energy influence or bribing political leaders, state capture is an important mechanism. Fomenting instability in the US and Europe is another way. I sort of like to use the analogy of the old Billy Joel song, "We Didn't Start the Fire," right? Russia doesn't start problems in the US or the West, but it loves to capitalize on them. So through either disinformation or in the past, in the Soviet era, through funneling money to groups that could be influential and disrupting in the United States, fomenting the instability in the US and Europe is a common tactic. And then finally, territorial issues and frozen conflicts in its near abroad. So places like Moldova, you've heard of Transnistria maybe. There's a couple of breakaway provinces in Georgia, Abkhazia, South Ossetia. In Ukraine, you've got the Donbass region and Crimea. These are all ways that Russia can accomplish its goals in its near abroad. Okay, so what are some of the means that Russia uses? The first is energy influence. I consider that a declining mean because it doesn't have near the influence that it had even 10 years ago with energy. But Russia is largely a natural resource extraction state. Oil, gas, mining, these are what these prop up the Russian economy. And so those are ways that Russia has leveraged its influence in Europe. Disinformation and propaganda. So I've looked at this from an open source perspective and found that the minimum that most professionals who've studied this area the minimum number they've come out is about $1 billion externally that Russia spends on propaganda every year. And some have said it's as high as 4 billion. It depends on who you talk to and what they're including, but that's a huge number for the Russian state to spend on propaganda. I wish in some ways that we had apparatuses that could put forth our message in the way that others do. Cultural diplomacy, which does include religion, is another way that particularly in its near abroad, that Russia spreads its messages. Military activity in the near abroad. So for those who've seen news about Ukraine recently, these Russian military activities that it has on Ukraine's borders, within its own territory, but on its borders and in the Black Sea, are a means of getting what it wants. In fact, right now, what's worth watching is there's kind of a de facto naval blockade Russia has in the Black Sea, in the Sea of Azov, where it's kind of choking Ukraine economically. And that's also worth watching. Technical assistance to autocrats. You see this in Africa and places where private military companies or others will be sent in to help strong men in Africa kind of retain power. And it's a way that Russia has influence in certain areas. And then finally, I would put down the strategic nuclear arsenal. Russia, like us, doesn't want to use that strategic nuclear arsenal, but it's a trump card, right? It's a way that Russia can leverage power by having the only nuclear arsenal in the world that's an existential threat to the United States. Okay, so what are some fissures and areas of weakness? Because I get asked this quite a bit. Well, though there's not a lot of data, I think there is a difference in the way that some Russian elites, who are what we call the siloviki, the security service minded folks in the Kremlin, and other elites view domestic problems. Those who have economic interests in Russia, where their power base is economically based, they're a little more concerned about domestic problems and domestic discontent than perhaps the Kremlin. And I think that's worth watching if there's some fissures there. The second weakness, but I think it's one that we in the US sometimes misunderstand, is Russia's domestic economy and how weak it is. The US has been pouring on sanctions for a long time, but Russia is very, very resilient against those sanctions, whether it's their import substitution or other areas. Russia's economy has suffered, and yet the regime has not changed its ways. And that's important to understand, that though there's a weak economy, Russia does not have the economic power that China has. I mean, China's arguably best instrument of national power is its economic power. Russia's still been pretty resilient. And then finally, Russia's not achieved its goals in Ukraine despite the emphasis there. And since 2014, you could argue that Ukrainian unity has risen, that the country has become more cohesive. And I think that's worth watching to see if that shows some weakness in Russia's strategies. Okay. Then people sometimes ask me about countering Russian influence. So if there is a negative Russian influence from the Russian state, how is it countered? And so I like to talk about this because this is where we as citizens should be informed. The first is exposing propaganda and disinformation efforts. I will admit, I actually wrote a long paper here at IU that no one will ever read about disinformation and what we should do about it. And a lot of that had to do with Russia. We need to expose propaganda when we see it. And even those disinformation efforts that we see in Europe that happen, we need to do a better job of calling it out. And frankly, I think as a government, because we're very laissez-faire with our economic and our media activities, we don't probably do enough of that as we could. We also need to strengthen transatlantic partnerships and those alliances. Jim's heard me say this, but recently, the Biden administration released what they call the Interim National Security Strategic Guidance. I think I got that right. What that is any new administration comes in and they release their sort of strategy, broad brush strategy of where they want to go. And then they have the National Security Council and other groups write that strategy, right? This is our strategy. And the number one thing that jumped out at me in that strategy was strengthening our international alliances and partnerships. And I was glad to see that. Not just because I'm going to a NATO job next, but also because we get a lot of bang for our buck by being part of NATO and these other partnerships. Stronger working through these partnerships is really important. It's another means of communication that we can have that isn't quite at the State Department diplomatic level to work with our allies and get on the same page. And I can tell you that in my role as a military officer working in some of my jobs with foreign militaries, we get a lot out of working with our NATO partners. There's a lot we can do with countries where we sometimes have friction or we disagree diplomatically. And working military to military, we can share information and we can have some interoperability, and it does a lot for strengthening our ties. So I think that's a really, really big way of countering negative influences. Encouraging energy diversification in Europe is another big one. In the last decade or so, there's been a lot of progress made in energy diversification in most areas. The one I haven't seen and that I am a little concerned about is that since 2011, the Fukushima accident in Japan, some countries like Germany have said, hey, we're getting out of the atomic energy business completely. But the problem with that is that, as you know, there just isn't enough green energy to go around yet. And we don't have enough base energy unless you use more natural gas and oil to run these economies. And so there has to be a better mix. But generally speaking, I think energy diversification in Europe is on the upswing. And then finally, observing Russian-Chinese relations. There's some tension there, and I think that's worth watching. The more that those two countries, which don't always get along, can work out their own problems, probably the easier it is for us. And so I think that's worth watching. Okay, I think I got through that pretty quickly. I'm going to give myself a pat on the back and then open this up for questions, which is, again, always the more interesting part of this. So if any of you are awake, still here. Okay, Jody, go ahead.
So first of all, I messaged my husband to tell him you were speaking. And he said that he taught your son Thomas and he was a wonderful young man.
Oh, that was nice. That was nice to hear.
Where are you going on your NATO post?
I'm going to be the NATO Landcom G2, the Director of Intelligence in Turkey.
Excellent. Our daughter was stationed at NATO in Brunssum,
Oh, very nice.
Netherlands. Yeah,
It's a little warmer in Turkey, I think.
yeah,
But
she enjoyed it
Brunson's
very
nice.
much. It was lovely.
Yeah,
Um,
it's good close.
so I get, and this is not my area of expertise, it's my husband's, but what if Russia's economy is so weak, is it just their their propaganda that keeps people from their citizens from pushing back? I mean, if our economy was tanking, I mean, I guess I don't understand how they continue to have the power that they have if their economy is that fragile.
So that's a good question. It really comes down to that fundamental difference between the U.S. mindset. We're a very consumer-oriented people, right? We care about individual liberty and freedom, which, as we discussed before, my presentation started about masks, right? That's a big issue in this country. The Russian population has been conditioned to abrogate freedom in the interest of security, state security, and a lot of nations do that, right? Anybody who had that communist past has been frankly conditioned to some of that. So are people in Russia happy that their economic situation is what it is? No, but they have been convinced, some of them have been convinced that security concerns against the West are overriding, and they should, in patriotic duty, they should be concerned about their defense against the West. And that propaganda machine that I mentioned, I mean, internal Russian propaganda is relentless against the West. We are, you know, the great Satan in Russia, according to, you know, Russian television and Russian state media. Like, it's all about how bad the West is. So if you look at some of the challenges we've had in the U.S. with disinformation, which I don't want to get into too far, you know, there's only so far I can go there. Just think about that magnified in a country where you don't have the open media that we have now, where there's far less of that. And we have our own media problems and polarization, but at least generally we have opportunities to spread messages if we want to, whether or not somebody listens. If you're in a country where you can't even, you know, publicize certain things, then it becomes even harder for the public to get out of that mindset or to recognize that maybe what they're being told is not reality. So I think that's the biggest challenge.
And I noticed that you mentioned about their energy export, because they had a big hold on like the Balkans and some of the former Soviet Republic countries with transporting oil, correct?
Yeah, so the pipeline issue is one that's very, very interesting, and we don't have time to go into too much of that. But since Russian aggression about the mid-2000s, a number of nations have figured out that it's valuable to have alternatives to Russian oil pipelines coming through certain areas, right? Now, Russian oil and gas are still ubiquitous, particularly in Eastern Europe, and there's a lot of dependency, but there's far more diversification than there used to be. And even if Russian oil and gas are coming in writ large and fueling a lot of these countries, the transit issues have become less stovepiped. So that was a big issue with Ukraine years ago, where Russia had a dispute with Ukraine and wanted to flex its muscles, and it cut off the supply of oil and gas for a while. I think it was gas, I'm sorry. And that caused huge reverberations in Eastern Europe, and so there's been more diversification. And yet there's challenges with, you know, you might have heard of Nord Stream 2. This is a big one right now in the media, where their interests in Germany, they want to have another pipeline that comes under the Baltic Sea that goes into Germany. There's a lot of people concerned that this will cause problems if Russia will have too much influence by doing that. So there has been some diversification, and I think that's healthy. And some of that now comes through Turkey. You have a pipeline that comes through from the Caucasus region, and some good things are happening. Even liquid natural gas, some of the terminals have been helpful, but diversification has been good.
So how do they, I want to go back to kind of the people, and if you're my age, you know, in your 40s, they surely remember the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. How do they reconcile that actually happened and that the Soviet Union collapsed with the propaganda that Russia's the best and the US is the devil, and yet the US hasn't collapsed, even though I'm sure they're escalating all the different problems we have. Wouldn't the common person there think, well, why haven't they collapsed? And yet, do they just not have memory?
Actually, that's an interesting point. So I'll play, I don't want to say devil's advocate, but I'll take sort of the Russian side here, right? The mentality that Russia has had is that they were hung out to dry following the collapse of the Soviet Union. The 90s were a terrible, terrible time in Russia. Lawlessness, organized crime everywhere. It was a bad, bad time. And the Yeltsin years, the Russian state was weak and people suffered economically. Some of that had to do, frankly, with US policy, well, US advising that I think was misguided. There were academics from Harvard and other places in the US that went over and said, hey, you need to have shock therapy right away. And so there became this banditry of the Russian state that was problematic. And so people looked at that lawlessness, and eventually you ended up with Putin, who had huge approval ratings in the early 2000s because he took them out of that period and created some stability. So when you look at that contrast between, what happened after the fall of the Soviet Union and what you have now, people might be frustrated that their freedoms have been slowly eroded, right? And you have a movement with, Navalny and others that there's a certain part of the Russian intelligentsia and Russian middle class that are frustrated. But what you also have is you have a Russian population that doesn't want to go back to those lawless times in the 90s. And there's a lot of association with Western market economies and economic problems. In 2008, our financial crash here, they had the same problem in Russia, and it was devastating to their economy too. And people have not forgotten that. So we look at market economies and capitalism in such a favorable light because we've been doing it for so long, and it's a political and social mantra that we've had in this country for 200 years. There's a lot of skepticism in Russia about capitalism, right? And it was a dirty word for a long time. So that takes generations to work through. Just like for some people, socialism is a dirty word, right? And there's a visceral reaction to that. People, it takes a long time for people to change their mindset about political and social philosophies. And I think that's what you see there.
I see Jim's got his hand up for a question. Go ahead, Jim, and then Russ after. You're muted, Jim.
You said you love Russia, you love the Russian people. Everybody I've ever met from Russia has been awesome, and I love them too. But why do you love Russia? Why do you love the Russian people? And you mentioned their view of capitalism. How do they view their oligarchs? You've got some people there who are of tremendous wealth. Your comments, please.
So I'll break those into two. Russian culture has a deep history which interests me. And I find the Russian people rather warm when you get to know them personally. They can be very generous, but they've suffered through close to a century of communism, and life has been hard in Russia. It's a place where the weather is not kind, and there's been warfare and invasion over years, and then political systems that haven't worked out. But I find that as I work with the Russian people, I find they're fairly straightforward, believe it or not. Now, that's not true of the Russian state. And
very apologetic. She said, could I?
And Russian security services, but that's a different matter, right? So I find not only do I have an academic interest there, but I have known some great people, and I still have some friends there. So I find that Russian people are like Americans. You get to know people anywhere in the world, and they're good people. Just about anywhere you go, I think you find that you spend time learning a culture, and you realize, God, we have some political problems in this country, but the people are generally people, right? The second issue that you have mentioned about oligarchs. Well, let me ask you this question, Jim. How do you feel about Jeff Bezos or
Bill Gates?
Bill Gates, right? People have mixed feelings about our super wealthy individuals in this country that own large segments of our economy. And I imagine from what I've read, that there's similar feelings there. The big difference is that there's a wide recognition in their society that if you had that much wealth, you had to do something dirty to get it. And I think, but there's also
I think we have that here too.
Yeah, there's probably that, but there's a cynicism, I think, in Russian society that doesn't exist here. Maybe it's increasing here, but there's a general cynicism there of, well, this is kind of the way it is. Like, I don't like it, but it is the way it is. And I think that happens in any country where you have a wealth gap. People get frustrated. So I'm not sure how different that is than here, but the level of corruption is so much higher in Russia. I mean, it's just, if you're keeping your wealth, you're doing it in a way that the state is helping you disadvantage your people. I hate to say that. And you can make the same argument in this country if you want to, but I'm not going to. But there are people who do, and we have our own social challenges. So throwing rocks is probably not helpful that way.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Russ.
So I'm curious, going back to what you're saying in the beginning, we certainly have a unique stance in the world in that we essentially have not been invaded for most of our history, and we have some natural protections that virtually every other country doesn't have. The question for me is, do you, at base level, is the Russian attempted expansion and military power and the like aggressive or defensive?
Well, that's a good question, and I have this discussion a lot in minor policy circles, right, where we've had some discussions about that very issue. Is, I don't look at the world as binary, right? Good versus evil. That's fun when you're watching a Marvel movie, but that's not really how the world works, right? And there's that old adage of, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, right? It depends on where you are in some cases, right? Life is complicated. That's what I tell my kids. So I look at some of this and I say, and this is actually a great point, because I wish I could disclose the conversations, but we've had discussions with some of our senior leaders in the military and said, hey, there's a real belief that in many in the Russian security services, that some of our defensive weapons, like air defense systems and missile shields, that they have offensive capability, that we mean them, we're up to no good. And we look at NATO expansion. I personally think that NATO expansion to the east, whether or not it was well-intentioned or, like, that ship has sailed, right? We have a pretty large, robust NATO presence in Eastern Europe. I think it provides a lot of security and stability. I'm a big fan. But if you're Russia, you look at that as encroaching, as being concerning to you. So I understand the perspective, and that's where, some would look at if you're familiar with Samuel Huntington's sort of The Clash of Civilizations political philosophy, you kind of see where there's some natural tension and loggerheads between these great civilizations. And I think that that's natural. I think what we're trying to do, and this is a messaging problem in the US, is that we have a hard time standing for a message that we're consistent with. And, again, I don't want to make any of this political, but that's a real problem in the US, is like, there are a lot of people, particularly in Indiana, a lot of Hoosiers who think, hey, we're a city set on a hill. We're a light unto the people. We have some great things in this country to export culturally and in terms of democracy, but our messaging can use some work, right? We're inconsistent, and I think that that's part of the challenge, is that we are not consistent in what we want and ensuring there's a level playing field. So I think that there's some legitimate concerns of encroachment.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Tim.
I have a question about the Russian-Chinese relationship. I remember many years ago hearing and reading about the dislike the Chinese had for the Russians because Russia was very domineering and China overruled the Chinese and belittled them. And the Chinese came away very negative. Do you think that situation is improving now when you say the relation between those two countries is important to watch?
I don't. And I caveat that I am not an expert on China, but I have worked many of those issues. And I can say that I think that there is a natural tension between those two countries. They have a huge border, and quite frankly, they have some territorial issues that have not been resolved over time. There are migratory issues in Siberia that are very concerning to the Russian state. I don't think this is inappropriate to say, but the Chinese state has engaged in intellectual theft of everyone in a way that is virtually unprecedented in history. And there's a lot written about this. You can just Google this. I mean, just the level of buying industries or aircraft to reverse engineer engines. I mean, it's ubiquitous. And I think everybody has to know that that's a challenge. So I think there's going to be some natural tension as even with trade, making sure that those deals that are done, let's say it's an oil pipeline in Siberia, making sure those are on fair terms. And so I just don't see that relationship getting better.
I'll share a little bit of Rotary history about Russia. Probably in the late 70s, early 80s, we had a presentation by the Russian Minister of Public Education. He was at IU at some program, and he came and spoke to us through an interpreter. And one of the things he said that I've never forgotten, when you talked about how the spread of Russia territorially was so broad, and at that time the Soviet Union was still intact, he was asked how many languages were taught in public schools in Russia, and his answer was 39. I've never forgotten that it was so spread out and so diverse and so many different groups and ethnic backgrounds that they had to teach school in 39 different languages.
Actually, you bring up a great point. It's a misconception about Russia. And I've had this question come up a lot, and I like to share it. So I appreciate you bringing that point. There's an image of Russia that people had, sort of I'll call it the Rocky IV, Dolph Lundgren image of sort of the Aryan-looking Russian, right? That everyone in Russia is sort of this prototypical Russian, right? Russia actually is a very ethnically diverse country. Only about 50% of the country are truly ethnically Russians. There's a lot of minority groups in Russia. The Russian Empire was very diverse, arguably as diverse as the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And that has caused social tensions today. There's constant, friction and ethnic strife in the Caucasus region. Russia has a lot of security concerns on some of its Muslim minorities. So you're right, it's a very multi-ethnic nation. Under the Soviet period, there was a lot of rhetoric given to ethnic minorities, and yet some of those issues were tamped down. That's a problem with Ukrainian nationalism today, was that the Ukrainian language was suppressed under the Soviet Union, under Tsarist Russia and the Soviet Union. So there's a lot of animosity today. But you're absolutely right that it's a far more diverse country than people think. And it gets more diverse, the farther you go into the Russian provinces. So that's a great point.
I want to pause for just one moment. And first I want to thank you for coming today, Colonel Lacy. And if you can stick around, I think people have a few more questions, but it is 1 o'clock. If anybody's needing to sign off for work, feel free to do that. But if you're able to stick around, we are too.
I don't mind. Yeah.
Wonderful. And
All
right, Jim, if you don't mind, I'm gonna let Ryan jump his question in first, and then I'll have Jim go next.
Yeah,
I was
please.
actually signing off. I gotta go. So
Okay.
Thank you for your time, and appreciate it. Have a great day, everybody.
Have a good one, Ryan.
Bye, everyone.
Go ahead, Jim.
Okay, Colonel Lacy, I was just going to say, I'm so glad that you and your family got to see Vincennes yesterday. And it just kind of makes me wonder, you were here in Indiana probably for the first time, I think. As I recall, you grew up in Washington State, is that right?
That's correct. Yeah.
And I think your wife is from Florida, maybe?
Northern Idaho, very similar.
Okay. Oh, yeah. Okay. So anyway, this was maybe kind of a new experience for you being in the Midwest, and you were here at a difficult time for all of us with COVID. It was difficult wherever you were. But what's going to be your takeaway People ask you, when you get with your new unit over in Turkey, hey, what was Indiana like? And, what are your thoughts there? And number two, speaking of COVID, I just wonder what effect COVID has had on the Russian people, if you know. So.
Oh, good questions. So in answer to your first question, I have really enjoyed my time here in Indiana. I like it here quite a bit, actually. We like everything about Indiana except Bedford. My wife had a bad experience in a Walmart parking lot there. But no, I say that in jest, but we have really enjoyed the people here, and I actually find Hoosiers to be a pretty balanced group. So as an outsider, my experience in the Midwest was some time in the Kansas City area at Fort Leavenworth, and I really thought people were pretty down home there, and I see a lot of similarities with Hoosiers to that area, believe it or not. I think the Midwest is just a nice place, and I like it. But I would say that I think the perspective I've had at IU is very similar to the rest of the state, which is that there's a pragmatism that this area has, which is really refreshing. People are able to balance not only political philosophies, but I think people are able to kind of find common solutions. I was impressed with the way that and I don't know anything about your governor, but the way that they kind of handled COVID. I was kind of impressed compared to other states. Like I said, I'm from Washington, and there was a lot of angst out there about the way that it felt very heavy-handed, and it didn't feel that way here. And so I've been kind of impressed by this state where it takes pragmatic solutions. So I've actually been, it's a great place. I would come back here, if there was employment in the future and the Army said they were done with me. I looked at Indy and said, I can do that, right? Probably never find a job in Bloomington, but it's a nice place. So I've enjoyed that. As far as COVID and the Russian people, that's a good question. So this goes back to the Sputnik vaccine. So for those who aren't familiar, Russia has a vaccine that they developed, and everyone's suspicious of the efficacy just because, Russian data, if you're doping your athletes, how for the Olympics, how on a state level, how reliable is the data? But what I've seen is that it's a reasonably effective vaccine. I think there's enough evidence that it's probably pretty effective. How effective? Who knows? I don't think there's enough studies on any of this stuff. I think that the numbers, like in a lot of countries, have not been accurately reflected in statistics. I think there's been a lot more suffering in the provinces and other areas of Russia from what I've seen. But you don't see in the media the same level of reporting. So that's tough. But I think the indications are that they've suffered, not on the level of India currently, but there's been a lot more suffering than probably come out. But I think it's valuable that they have mobilized their vaccine and they're using that as a form of state policy and leverage in Europe right now. So I think that shows that they've managed the crisis as well as some.
Do you think that they're mobilizing their vaccine in an equal or in a fair format to making it available to everyone, or is there like a hierarchy of access, do you think?
I can't say for sure. I don't know enough about it. But what I would suspect, just from what I know about Russian logistics, is that, all big nations, including ourselves, have trouble with logistical issues, right? Getting everything, particularly to rural areas. I would be shocked if Russia was able to distribute its vaccine equally to its rural areas and its provinces the way it could in somewhere like Moscow.
Right.
And I don't know that that's a nefarious intent. I just think that that's hard to do. So I'd be surprised if it was particularly equitable. I don't want to use that term, but if the distribution was even. But I don't know that that's some evil plot. I just think that's hard to do in a country like Russia.
Do they give people the choice of taking the vaccine, or do they just say you're getting it and go around and stick people?
I think there's a choice. I would suspect. I would suspect there is, but I think that people frankly want it because they've publicized it well enough that I think, like here, there are going to be people who don't want it anywhere, but I don't think they're lining everyone up at gunpoint. I think it's like that. But
it's a fair question.
It is a
but
good question.
if they have the kind of greater good for the greatest number kind of philosophy of,
Well,
as a
some people
country,
put the
then that
state
makes,
before people. Yeah.
yeah, then that makes
There
sense.
is certainly more a sense of communalism
Mhm.
in Russia. That's more of a communal society than we are. Actually, everyone's more communal than we are, pretty much. But but yeah, I think there's some of that for sure.
So I have another energy related question. So you mentioned that they were kind of on the decline for that being a means or a source of power for them.
And a lot of that is due to price. The
So
price of oil has dropped. I mean, it just can't provide the revenue it did before.
So my question is, from a strategic perspective for the US and NATO, wouldn't it be wise for us to try and adopt in the next 20, 30 years a lot more green technology, because that produces all your energy locally, and you would completely shut off their funding from Eastern Europe and Central Europe and places?
Well, I think that's something the current administration is trying to do. The challenge, and this is, again, this is just me and my study, and so this is not, official government policy, but the real problem with green technology, and I'm a fan, by the way, would love to have a Nissan Leaf or whatever, or a Tesla if he wants to give me one. But the real challenge is that there's an environmental cost. We don't have the mining infrastructure in the world to produce all of the rare earth minerals that would require to have, say, electric cars, for instance. You just don't have them. So yes, theoretically, if we could have green, but the problem with green technologies, and this is my frustration, is that you're solving one problem and creating another. So the reality is, and this is why I don't think we're going to completely move away from combustion engines nearly as quickly as people think globally, is if you're trying to get at an environmental problem of, say, greenhouse emissions, right? Then electric vehicles make a ton of sense. Or if your concern is that you're driving in a major metropolitan area and you have smog, electric cars are great. But if globally your idea is that there's an impact to the environment and many impacts, like we're not treating Mother Earth well, and so we need to go green. The challenge is that producing solar panels or wind turbines or battery powered vehicles, we don't have enough rare earth minerals currently in production, and it takes 15 to 17 years is the estimates I've seen. I think there was actually a good Wall Street Journal article about this the other day. We just don't have the infrastructure in the world to mine all of that, and mining is a really environmentally costly activity. So the challenge is I just don't think we can get there because I don't think we have the resources to go green enough. And then you get back to the issue of base energy versus variable energy, if you know what I'm talking about, where
I very much know what you're talking about. And,
okay.
But I'm
so
actually not looking at it from an
challenge.
environmental perspective. I'm looking at it from a strategic perspective.
Well, that's what I'm saying is I don't think we have the strategic resources to do so. We don't in the US lead in the production of rare earth minerals. Guess who does? China.
China, yeah.
And so, yes, I think it would be somewhere, and I think our administration probably would like to get there. I just don't think it's tenable in the next 50 years to do that on the scale that we'd like. My hope is that emerging technology solves some of those problems. Maybe that's wishful thinking, but that seems to be what happens in history, is that
there's a lot of emerging ones that are coming out. I was just thinking, we seem to have a lot of problems with Russia. We seem to have a lot of problems in the Middle East, and all their economic bases are based on natural gas and oil.
Yeah, or Venezuela, or you name the petrol state, right?
If you eliminate those as a source of economic engine for them, then what happens?
Well, it's interesting because I think something will take its place, right? We look at sources of wealth and over history. Again, I'm just pontificating, but it used to be in the medieval period that the source of wealth was land, right? Yeah. That's right now, that's not the thing. Then we moved into natural resources where you had coal, we have oil. We're moving into an area where the source of wealth is becoming technology and intellectual capital. So maybe if you eliminate those things in these societies, that they find something else that becomes a resource to harness. I don't know what that is, but it would be interesting to see, wouldn't it? I do think, though, that you're on the right track, that diversification is important, and you have countries that are trying to do it. I just don't think it'll happen fast enough to completely shut off the spigot for a country like Russia. I just don't think you can do it. What I think you can do is you can reduce their influence enough to where they don't have hegemony over, a neighboring nation. And that's really valuable.
And
So I think they're right.
The other question I had is I think it was Bulgaria and the Ukraine were not in NATO, but those were kind of the two that weren't. Is there a
Bulgaria's
reason?
in NATO.
Oh, it is?
Yeah.
Is there a reason the Ukraine hasn't joined in order to try and end some of its conflict?
They
with
want to
Russia?
join. Actually, there's some speculation, whether or not you buy this argument, that the invasion of Georgia in 2008 was a result of a NATO conference in Bucharest in early 2008 that said, NATO publicly said, we're going to let eventually Ukraine and Georgia join NATO. Russia didn't like that. So yes, Ukraine, they have a national policy that they want to join NATO, but I think that could be tricky. And the other problem is that right now, NATO has a policy it has since the 90s that it doesn't allow new NATO members to join that have outstanding territorial issues with another nation, particularly with another NATO nation. So right now there's some issues that Ukraine has, and it has occupied territory. So nobody wants to let in somebody to the club that has Russia occupying its territory. So that, I think, right there is pretty tricky. But a good question.
Does anybody have any other questions? Well, thank you very much, Colonel Lacy. I really appreciate you coming today. It was a wonderful presentation, and I wish you well in Turkey. I'm sure you'll do an outstanding job over there. And yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Everyone have a great weekend, and we will see you all next week when we have one of the first female Eagle Scouts in Southern Indiana come and speak to our club.
Thank you, Brian. Happy birthday.
Thanks. Have a great one.
Thank you, Colonel.